I think we should officially start. We've got a very packed schedule today. Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for joining so short notice, but we really want to get this going, and you had a lot of questions as well, so we really want to just get straight into it and deep dive into your questions. Here's the agenda for today. So classic, just quick housekeeping, and then then we have Adriaan, who's going to join us to chat about the approaching companies and the interview process, which we're really excited to chat about. And then we have a few candidate experiences that we'd like to share with you so far. And then we'll round off with an interactive Q&A and then wrap it up. Perfect. So without further ado, let's get going. So please all stay on mute. It would be awesome if you share your face. Always nice. If you have a question, we'll just raise your hand, and then you're more than welcome to interrupt. As you know, it will be recorded. I'll post it afterwards on our YouTube channel for those that cannot make it. And always interact if you'd like. It's going to be a smaller group, so if you do have a question, we'd love to chat to you. All right, so straight into it. Deborah?
Yes, welcome everybody. I'm very happy to introduce you today to Adriaan Kroon, who is here to answer a lot of questions that you've raised throughout the last few weeks. Without any further ado, Adriaan, maybe you can briefly introduce yourself, your role at the Talent Committee, but also what you are doing in the Bay Area.
Yeah, sure. So Adriaan, I moved to the Bay Area about 4 years ago. Before that, I studied in the US. So I have a bit of experience from back then also of how the recruiting culture here is. Then lived in the Netherlands for about 5 years, working for McKinsey, a consulting company in Africa and Europe. And then moved to the Bay Area to work in clean tech. And I've worked in various angles of it. I've worked more on the software side, also in the more hard tech side, in the indoor agriculture company, and also on the investment side. So whatever you guys are interested in, hopefully I'll be able to answer it. Some of the things I might be saying are more geared towards early stage startups or smaller companies. So less to like, if you're looking at the Googles of the world, I know some of you are looking at applied materials. That's maybe a little later stage, and actually might look more like a standard Dutch application procedures as well.
Thank you so much, Adriaan. And when it comes to hiring in the Bay and basically applying for a role, do you have any real good tips for the students from top of my mind that you would like to share with them, do's or don'ts, to increase their chance?
I think the classic one that you guys have probably all heard a million times, but it still is an important calibration point, is just the overselling of the US versus Dutch culture. I can't overstate that, the difference, where, I mean, essentially most like 23-year-old Americans sell their CV as if they're UN Secretary General. And Dutch students will actually say, well, actually, I did a fairly standard curriculum. I'm not that different from my friends and colleagues. And I think that's just very, very important, because what I notice with American friends and colleagues is they don't calibrate appropriately for that. So they kind of look at it through an American lens and say, oh, that's not, that's not really up to the standard we're looking for, because you haven't solved world hunger yet. And the other piece, I think, is, and we can go a bit more into that, I think, in your questions, but is to be very proactive. And this kind of goes to the early stage companies. Be proactive in like offering examples and like outlining your background. So I think what I see in the Netherlands, at least a lot, is that people understand very clearly what your background is. If you studied call it civil engineering in Delft, or you studied electronics engineering in Eindhoven, or if you did law in Leiden, people understand very clearly what you can't do. They see your activities, they have a sense of what that is. And that's something that in the US is very hard to gauge. And I think also a part that feeds into it that's not obvious to Dutch students, I think always, is that every Dutch university is more or less the same in quality. if you study in Eindhoven or Delft, like nobody really cares. Whereas here, there's a huge difference in quality. And if you don't kind of proactively start calibrating that and you say, I did this project, or I did this kind of coursework, people can't really judge the level it's at. And I think actually Dutch universities are incredibly good compared to most US universities. So having like an MSc, for instance, in the Netherlands is very much equated to like having an MSc from Stanford or so, where that is considered like almost like an academic track here, whereas it's fairly standard in the Netherlands to do. So yeah, I'll stop here because I think we can dive deeper if you guys want in the questions. But yeah, I think those are important points.
Thank you so much. And then maybe one last question right now for you, Adriaan. What would be your main tip for students when they are doing proactive outreach themselves to companies within their network or online? Any do's and don'ts that you see there for them that might be helpful?
So I think there's two things there. And I think it splits along like the stage the company is at in some ways. So if you're applying for the Googles or the Applied Materials of the world, those are big corporates that kind of have a pipe, like they have team budgets, they have roles, they're very like standardized. They're like, I don't know what you compare to, like in the Netherlands, maybe Philips or Ahold, where it's like, these are the standard kind of trajectories people go through, and particularly for entry-level positions or internships, it is just what it is. Like what is on the website or what you hear about are the things you can apply for. So I think in that case, it's just explaining why you are very well capable of that role. I think if you look at smaller stage companies, what is important is to just get to the point on what you can offer to a company, even if it doesn't quite map to what is on their website or etc. So I think a few things to note about job openings and kind of what smaller companies say they're looking for is, and why that is often not what they're actually looking for, is one thing, they often haven't thought that much about it. So they'll just put a bunch of job vacancies online because they think they need that. And you might say, well, I've looked at your company and I've worked in a similar setup before, and I think you could really use this skill I have. So if you can concisely like communicate that to the HR manager or the actual hiring manager, they'll be like, oh yeah, actually we should think about that. Like if you can make a strong case why you have a relevant skill set, let's talk about it. The other part of it is that companies will often leave, like hiring is a big kind of PR tool here as well. So I've worked at companies where there were a lot of vacancies online that didn't actually exist anymore, but they're not going to take them offline because it looks like the company is struggling. So like these hiring websites are quite often complete nonsense, where they might not be hiring for that. The person who was the hiring manager has left already. There's such high turnover. So the next person wants to come in and define their own roles. So I think the thing to look at with these small companies, kind of like, okay, is this a company that fits my skill set somehow, and can I sell myself to them? And it's much more of a sales process as a whole person, rather than kind of like, okay, I'm very good for that specific vacancy here.
Great, thank you, Adriaan. One last question, because this is also one that has reached us quite a few times from the students, is how can they rock an interview? We've talked about approaching companies, but then actually while you're sitting on the chair during an interview, any main tips that you have for them for this particular moment?
Yeah, I don't think this is very different from the US or the Netherlands, but what I would do is I would actually say, like, you want to map out the capabilities. So say a job description, or the job that you think you should be having says, okay, you want you to demonstrate leadership in this field. We want you to show technical ability in this, etc. Like, just list those and take your resume and kind of just map them together. So say like, okay, these are actually the experiences in which I've demonstrated that. And the classic thing there is that you always want to have multiple examples, because the worst possible interview question is that you give a great example and then you say, okay, tell us about another time you did that. And then you have no example. So just think about like how to think about, like, how to map that out. and go through it. And then what you want to do is you want to actually really practice the anecdotes to get to the main point within like the first few sentences, and just say, hey, this is actually why I'm really good at that, and that will then stick. Whereas if every one of those anecdotes becomes kind of a 15-minute chat, then you don't leave a lot of time to like show that you've done a lot of other things as well.
Very clear. Thank you, Adriaan. Michelle, I suggest that we now go over a few pre-submitted questions that have reached us from the students for Adriaan to react to.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'll kick it off with the first one. So, which is, how good or bad are the chances of getting an internship position when directly contacting a company versus applying for one of the job listings of an internship? Should one of them be prioritized?
Yeah, I think again that splits a bit over large companies versus smaller. Smaller, you definitely have like a high likelihood, because if you kind of say, hey, look, I'm a skilled person, I really like what your company is doing, and I have some relevant experience, then most companies will be like, sure. Like a lot, there's actually like the advantage you have right now is that there's a huge shortage in the labor market here, like as in the Netherlands, and that you're basically a highly skilled worker who doesn't come with a lot of kind of preconceptions of all the perks they should have and everything, and you can just come in and start helping out a company. The larger companies, that's a bit less so, but given the shortage in the job market, again, like it might work. Like your chances are probably higher than a couple of years ago. But in that case, I would really try to come up with a unique angle. An example, for instance, is that I once, when I moved here first, I contacted a senior executive directly through LinkedIn at a company, and you just come up with what the angle is, and you make it. This happened to be a Dutch person who was in the logistics business, and I just said, look, I really like the logistics business. I forget exactly what example I gave about how I'd worked in it, and do you have somewhere to work in your company? And then they passed that on to their HR department. They said, okay, probably this is an interesting job. So if you're gonna like directly contact, like do make it kind of short and snappy and like something that's like memorable, because you get swamped by kind of like, oh, I'm very interested in what you do, can we talk? And it's very hard to judge whether how interested someone actually is, whether they actually know what you're doing, like a lot of those things. So if you're going to reach out directly, make it very clear why, and that you really actually research the company.
Yeah, I can emphasize the research the company, but particularly make sure you've done a little bit of homework before you just send out a very standard message, because those tend to just get ignored. All right, the next is, how can you best approach companies if your university is quite unknown, as US companies seem to place much value on the name of the university?
I think that's where the skill set actually comes in. So that's where you actually emphasize the coursework you've done, what kind of thesis you wrote, those things. I think there's also, that's becoming less and less so. Like I think and particularly in Silicon Valley, the technical universities are making a name for themselves. But for instance, if you come from Wageningen for agriculture, like people know that in food companies in the Bay Area, like they know that that's a world-class university. So I think this is not such a big problem anymore as it might have been before. But emphasize what you've actually done within and like the level of your coursework, because I think people are often a bit surprised by it, because yeah, to my example before, a lot of people here only have an undergrad, and they don't quite consider that a master's in the Netherlands, it does equate to a master's at a lot of top universities here. So just even emphasizing that fact is a big deal.
No, perfect. Next question is, how can you best approach companies if you have more of a social science background and interest in PR, marketing, user interface design? So not the classic computer science and engineering majors. How do you approach that?
I find that hard to answer, frankly, just from a perspective of, this is a slightly uninformed answer, given that I'm not coming from that angle and I don't have as much experience with it. But I think then it really becomes about like your portfolio. like what you've done before, or emphasizing why you're willing to kind of like do the groundwork and learn it. So yeah, I think that's just the basic there, like show your job experience. And that's the one advantage you do have in the US versus the Netherlands, I would say, is the Netherlands is very much like, well, I consider it, I think it's changed a little bit over time, but the routes are very paved. Like if you've studied a certain thing in university, like people expect you to do certain things, and it's very hard to say like, okay, I studied law, but I'm really interested in food marketing. Then like people are like, oh, but how does that make sense? Whereas here, if next to law, you like, I don't know, worked in the restaurant business, people be like, oh, okay, but like the law degree shows that you're like, you have a certain skill set and you can think at a certain level. But sure, you've shown it, you've demonstrated interest, you've had some success in that, like, sure, come on board. So I think from that perspective, like emphasizing kind of your extracurriculars or your achievements in that specific field is like much more acceptable here than in the Netherlands, maybe.
Yeah, no. Next question is, so what are the top 3 most important things to consider when having an interview with a Silicon Valley company compared to that of a European one?
Yeah, so I think those are the 3, it's like the overselling part, the actual like fact that the person across the table from you might not have put that much effort into like defining anything either, and that there's quite a bit of, and the upside that comes with it is that there's quite a bit of flexibility, where like the HR manager might like be sitting literally across the room, and if the 2 people who are like basically talking to you as a hiring manager and the HR person kind of agree that you would be a good fit for something else, that can go very fast. There's not kind of some corporate cycle they have to go through to make a decision the year after.
Nice. Next is, so I have an interview scheduled without a specific role description. How would you suggest that person prepares for an interview?
So I think that becomes, then it's really up to you to like be proactive in defining like, and kind of upfront, I would say, define like, hey, look, these are the things that I think this role requires, like this company requires, and then like this is a role I could play, and walk someone through that. That's basically what you want to do in an interview. Say, look, I've researched your company. This is like where I'm landing, just to kind of level set, because maybe that person is like, that's not relevant to us at all. And then you go from there, but and say, this is what I think I can contribute, and this is why I'm good at that. So this is the things I've done in the past that show that I can contribute to your company that way. So to make that a bit more concrete, say you apply for a fintech company, and they say, okay, we're looking for someone to come help us in general. Then define whether you've done business development before, whether you've done regulatory work before, so you can help them with compliance, and then walk them through why you would be a good fit for that. And frankly, the flip side is also true. If they don't respond well to that and they still don't have a very clear view, I would actually consider whether it's worth going to work for that company, bluntly put, because that probably means that they're not going to have a very clear work for you and very clear engagement for you or mandate when you get there, which is probably not a setup for success.
Yeah, and like you said, have those 2 examples, or more, at least more than one example ready, of how to highlight your story and what kind of makes you unique. I think if you prepare that well in advance, then the description is not necessarily necessary. Perfect. The next question is, any tips for negotiating salary with the company in the Bay Area region? What are some good and bad practices?
So what I would do in this case is just let them, this is like, as you come to the Bay Area, right? I would let them start with the negotiations, because the chances of you coming up with too low an offer are very high, because the salaries are just very crazy. Like interns get paid, like a lot of interns here will get paid essentially like a full-time salary that's like pro rata, or like they'll get paid like an entry level. It's not like in the Netherlands, I think that might have changed now, but where interns get paid like a different salary while they're basically doing an entry-level job, where you get like, I think back in the day it was like 900 euros or 1,000 euros that you would get for an internship, where you were basically doing the same thing as an entry-level person for a few months. Here you'll actually get paid for the work you do. So my sense is, like, basically from anything I've heard ever from Dutch people, is that they find the salaries here completely crazy, and that basically I would let the company come up with what they think is a fair offer. The one thing I would then go do is actually see, like, I think it's worth seeing, then looking into where would I live, what would my life look like, because the cost of living is also so high that you might say, well, I'm getting paid like 2x what I expected. But if you're in a certain part of the area, city, or if this company is a bit remote, you might need a car, you might need to get insurance. There's all kinds of costs that stack up quickly. So then do go back and kind of say, look, I can actually live a decent life from this or not. And otherwise go back to the company and be like, look, I did the calculations and this just doesn't really work out for me.
No, good. Is this also a conversation that you'd rather have with the HR partner rather than potentially one of the other people in the company interviewing you, because that's not their role?
Exactly. Like, most people would not make that decision, and like, just but what I would say is just be fairly reactive in this sense, because just because and so I think I see a question coming about what the average salary would be for engineering. It depends. It's very hard to say, but like, I think you can count entry level, like count at least 60 to 80K a year, and that's like on the low end, which I think is significantly higher than you would even make with MSc out of any Dutch company.
All right.
I think a good direct comparison is, I think if you look at Adriaan versus Stripe, which are basically the same companies, but one in San Francisco, one in Amsterdam, you'd probably be looking at almost a 2x difference.
Crazy. All right.
Well, dollar to euro, so not accounting some of the exchange, but
yeah, and I guess the living rate as well, to be fair.
Exactly.
All right, last question. So do companies in Silicon Valley usually want to hire an intern after the internship ends?
Yes, because they just, and particularly if you're, and that's why I emphasize the part of like really owning a certain mandate, and that's important, because then you can just flow on into it. The one difficult thing, but it's gotten a bit better now Trump is gone, is the visa process. So that's going to be something like that you need to be fairly proactive about. And that is actually one thing I should have mentioned before, but that's one thing that once you go into full-time roles does influence. No one will tell you this, like, and at bigger companies obviously less so, because they're more worried about liability, but it does influence your negotiation position, because basically your company needs to sponsor your visa. It is a lot of effort for them as well, and a bit of a pain and a lot of insecurity around it. So it's a lot of work for them, and basically it does influence what you can demand from them.
Perfect. That's our last question. Thank you so much. Very useful insights, for sure. Does anyone have any questions that they'd just like to raise their hand and unmute themselves for Adriaan, because after that he will be free to leave and then we'll carry on with the session. All right. If there are no further questions.
Yes, I do have a question.
Okay, perfect.
Hello, Adriaan. Thank you for the information and all the you've gave so far. I was wondering, we got a pre-email about giving information about this program and a way to contact companies. And here we can also add our resume. But I was wondering, is it also good to add a cover letter for this, or a reference letter in addition to your resume?
Yeah, I think it always helps. And there you can show kind of the research, like Michelle mentioned before, that you've really researched the company. And yeah, it makes a difference, because a lot of the time you'll just look quickly through the resume. The way I look at the resumes is just like, you quickly look, you're like, okay, this all makes sense. Like seems a certain level. If you can't quite place certain things, well, you might want to do follow-up. But then the second thing I do is kind of figure out, like, is this person a good fit, before I then go out and like try to triangulate, like, oh, is this relevant experience, or like go reach out to people in your company where it's like, okay, do we even want to work with this person? And having a reference, so kind of like decluttering that process where someone doesn't have to go back to you and say, hey, do you have a reference, or do you have a cover letter? Just makes it easier.
Would you
Like
suggest
anything you can proactively offer.
if I could just butt in, would you suggest that even for an open position? Because then how do you tailor that cover letter? How do you flavor that? Would you just then look at the company, look at its background, look at the gap that it needs, and then tailor the cover letter like that? Or how do you think?
Yeah, that's what I would do, is basically say, look, this is why I think I'm like an asset to your company.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then see the problem with this is you're taking a bit of a risk, right? You're taking the risk of like putting in a lot of work and like not getting any response, and it's a very frustrating process. So you can think, oh, it doesn't add any value, but you just need to hit the one person that does add value to. And what you do is you create basically a kind of hook to start talking from, right? Because if you kind of say, I'm broadly, here's my resume, please think of what I could do for your company, then like you're asking a lot of like brain bandwidth from someone who like might be having a bad day or whatever. Whereas if you or like is super busy or doesn't have time to look at it, whereas if you say, I think I can do this for you, that person might think, well, we don't really need that, but I do see that you say X, Y, Z. We do need someone like that. So you're immediately starting up a conversation. The problem is that 99% of the time you don't get a response, so it's very demoralizing, and it doesn't work. But I think it's worth doing.
Yeah, great. So we actually have another question from Federica. So if you unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm sorry I can't turn my camera on, but I had a curiosity basically, because I come from Italy, and in Italy it's very uncommon to disclose that, for example, your partner would be in your same work environment. But I've noticed that here in the Netherlands happens that if, for example, you have your partner that works in a department, it's easier for you to sort of get the position. And I was wondering if that's something that it's the same in the States, or again, it's none of their business, basically. Like, how's that relates?
So the question is basically whether you would proactively disclose that.
Because my partner is American, and I don't know if that's something to disclose or not. I feel like that's none of their business, but I've noticed here, for example, that I did an internship, for example, and they needed a new postdoc, and they got a postdoc also because her partner was already working in that department. And I've heard that's something quite common in the Netherlands, and I was wondering if that is the same in the States, or it's again, it's your private matter.
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's generally private matter. I know in academia, what you do see here at least, but that's not so relevant for this, is that because a lot of places, universities are very remote, that they do kind of co-hiring deals. That's like tangentially related, but I don't think generally you would have to disclose this.
Oh, okay, perfect. Because I thought it was very weird what happens here. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say it's more the exception. And if you don't want to share it, you shouldn't feel obliged to. So yeah, and I think maybe that might be a little academia niche, but that might have also been around a strange research group. So yeah. Next, we have two more students with hands up. So Faye, if you could unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how bad the background noise is right now. I'm working remotely.
That sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually really curious about if you have any, if you know any interesting platforms that might be useful to find companies to approach, because at the moment I'm actually going through LinkedIn, and yeah, I'm kind of Googling sustainable startups in Silicon Valley or in the Bay Area, but you kind of get a lot of companies. It's kind of difficult to filter. So I was thinking, do you know anything that might be similar to, I'm assuming you might be familiar with Yes Delft, or specific platforms? I've been trying to go through, for example, Y Combinator, just to look at interesting startups, but is there another tip maybe that you could give to have a more easy way of doing a targeted search for specific startups?
I find it hard because I haven't come across one that does very good quality control. Because I think that's a big problem, right? Like you can go to Hacker News and people will post all kinds of stuff, but for instance, because Y Combinator has become so big, it's hard to actually figure out, like, is this a real company? Like, okay, you guys funded it, but is this a real thing or not? I haven't quite, to be honest, a lot of these things here in my experience work through word of mouth. So I think what is worth, and frankly, I think this might be something that we could do better at as a program, is actually setting that up, because there's a lot of Dutch founders who then know other people in the network that might not immediately be connected. Yeah, and I think that's how it works. So I'll give you an example, and this is not very helpful, but just to demonstrate how hard this is I used to work for an incubator that did a lot of enterprise software, but also some health tech, etc. And in looking at those companies, there was a huge difference in quality and like even of the people, and like whether I would recommend whether they would do an internship, or like whether someone should do an internship with them or not, like whether it was a good platform to work with. And I would actually select specific ones. So some of them are actually in the internships in the Valley database, but a lot of them I was like, I don't think they're a good fit. But from the outside, there would be like no way you would see that, unfortunately. So it's a lot of word of mouth and just like a lot of talking to people about stuff. Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate, but I haven't come across like great platforms that way.
All right, thank you.
And then last question, and then we will move on to our next section of the webinar is Rain, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Adriaan, you have a lot of insight on the front line, especially then in the Bay Area, and there's something that I'm wondering about. I myself feel that I have a lot of expertise when it comes to academic ventures. It's something that I've focused on as I try to desire a more academic trajectory later on, attaining a PhD position. That does mean, because there are only 24 hours in a day, that I feel, even though I have done some extracurricular ventures, that I have done less extracurricular ventures than might be, for example, common if I would be doing a study in the US for that perspective. So when it comes to Bay Area companies, let's say that you excel very much from an academic perspective, there is some extracurricular work involved in that sense. Does it put me at a big disadvantage, or is it still something that is valued a lot?
I think it's valued a lot, actually, to be very focused. I think it's actually a place where, like, if you really have a hard skill set that you're very good at, the nice thing is you can find the right niche. Like it's very much a valuable asset. So I'm not sure what field you are in, but maybe that would make it easier to give an example.
So myself, I have joined in mathematics and economics.
Okay, yeah. This is the thing. If you say like, look, I have a math degree and I have this hard skill set. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing I think about, like, the Bay Area is a lot of extracurriculars get seen as like a nice networking tool, etc. Or if they're like hard skills, people will like be excited about it for a specific job search. But ultimately, like, it really comes down to the hard skill set you have and how it's applicable to the job. And in a way, it's the ultimate place to just be focused on like one dimension of like something you're really into, and finding a niche to like go apply that in. And more so than the Netherlands, I think, just because it's in a way a bigger startup economy. So there will always, in my experience, there's almost a startup company for anything you could imagine, and that you could probably like apply yourself to.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
I don't know if that's I don't know if
it's very insightful. Like the context that you provide, there's always a startup company that looks in a certain direction for everything that you can think of. That is a very, that gives some insight in that sense. So thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you to everyone for your questions. I think we'll move on to the next stage. And thank you, obviously, Adriaan. That was really nice to go into more detail about this process, for sure. Yeah, you're more than welcome.
Thank you all for attending, and let me know if there's more questions. I'll get them passed on from you guys, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. No, thank you again. And I will pass them on. Great.
Okay, bye.
Okay, cheers. All right, so then just quickly, because we do have some other questions that we thought weren't directly applicable for Adriaan, and we do want to answer all of them before the end of the session. So this next section will just be super quick. So yeah, general updates from me, and then we'll hand over for some Canada experiences, which is quite exciting. So the matching process, where are we now? So this is a pilot year. I think I need to emphasize that now. So we are busy kind of figuring out as we go as well. And all these things are also really useful for us. We are busy trying to lay the groundwork for our company network, and we are making a lot of progress. So currently we are in discussion with 17 companies. And over the past couple of weeks, we have shared 88 resumes. So some of you have, some of the resumes have been shared more than once per candidate. So this is amongst 52 candidates. And yeah, so the last 2 weeks we've had interviews lined up, which is really exciting. So we've had 15 interviews. And up until yesterday, we've had 2 students that have officially entered the contract negotiation stage, so which is really exciting. We hope that will only accelerate to the next few coming up. But this is also just to give you a quick overview of where we are at. And also just to remind you that this matching stage we are expecting to last for a while still. So it will be a gradual process where we'll also look for fall internships specifically. All right, and I'm going to hand over to Deborah just to kind of lay out where to find internships, because we do also offer beyond the Bay Area.
Thank you, Michelle. So basically, the program is called Internships in the Valley. The Valley is a pun with Silicon Valley, but basically, we want you to have the American tech experience, even if your role is not necessarily in tech itself. We think that a major draw of the program to many of you is experiencing the tech hubs in the US. The majority of that, to be honest, is based in and around Silicon Valley. Now here on these maps, you'll see that we actually often use the Bay Area as a reference because it's a bit broader than Silicon Valley itself. The Bay Area is really consisting of the 2 biggest cities, San Francisco, and then San Jose is actually a bit bigger still than San Francisco in the south. And if you move up from San Jose, you'll see Mountain View and Palo Alto, Redwood City, San Mateo. That entire stretch there, that is Silicon Valley. So that's really part of the peninsula. That's where a lot of the tech companies are based, such as Google, such as Netflix, and the likes of them. In San Francisco, you have a lot more startups that are based, I would say. And then you also have really active startups and scale-ups based in the East Bay. So when we cross the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, that brings you to Oakland and to Berkeley. And then in between, you also have Emeryville, which is a bit smaller, but where you have a huge life science and health accumulation. So basically anywhere within the Bay Area, even if it's in Marin, in San Rafael, or if you go all the way up to Concord or Walnut Creek, all of this is the Bay Area. And it's very easily connected. You can get very easy from point A to B with public transportation as well. It's basically often referred to as a whole, as one thriving ecosystem. And this is basically Silicon Valley at large. So that will be where the most of you are looking for an internship position right now. On the right side of the map, you'll see we have, you'll see that we have the North Bay, we have the East Bay, the South Bay, and the Peninsula. And then this Peninsula part, that is really Silicon Valley. And it can go as south as actually Santa Cruz, where you also have really nice tech ecosystem. Most of our students in the past have always been placed either in the East Bay in San Francisco or in the Peninsula, sometimes also in the South Bay as well, just to give you that as a reference. But our consulate goes a bit broader than that. Maybe we can go to the next slide now. Our consulate in San Francisco basically covers the 13 most western states when it comes to consular, but also economic servicing for Dutch companies and individuals. So this is a list of all of the states. We have quite a few interesting tech hubs within our resort, in addition to Silicon Valley and the Bay Area itself. The most comparable ecosystems can be found in SoCal, Southern California. And then we are looking at LA, Irvine, we're looking at Orange County, at San Diego as well. San Diego mainly known for aerospace, defense, and also life sciences and health. Los Angeles, when it comes to gaming, also a lot of fintech, also when it comes to a lot of media and entertainment companies. For example, Snapchat is based there as well. So this entire California strip is pretty comparable, but really I would say when it comes to high tech, that epicenter is really a bit more strongly still represented in and around Silicon Valley itself. In addition to California, we have very thriving tech ecosystems in Washington State. So that's all the way in the north, in Seattle. You're probably all familiar with the city of Seattle, thriving startup ecosystem, but also Microsoft, Amazon have their HQs actually in Seattle and not in Silicon Valley. So it might also be important for a few of you to know they have offices in the Bay, but they also have their HQ actually in and around Seattle. Portland, also in Oregon, pretty thriving, a bit more broad company profiles. For example, Nike has their HQ in Oregon, so it's not only tech. When we look at Arizona, that might be not something that you immediately think of, but Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the US and the fastest growing and the youngest one. Huge tech ecosystem, everything with regard to the semicon industry, the absolute hub in the US right now, also when it comes to autonomous and electric vehicles as well, a huge industry there. Also really thriving ecosystem, I think definitely worth looking into. And then lastly, Utah, we have Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City is also often called the Silicon Slopes. Also a lot of tech companies that have their presence there. We have really good contacts with Utah and also with Salt Lake City. However, maybe as a note of warning, the business climate there is a bit different than in a lot of other states in our resort, based on political and also religious reasons. So if you have any questions about that, you can always reach out to me. But one that I forgot to highlight here is obviously also Colorado, Denver, and Boulder, very thriving also when it comes to tech. So I would say those are really the highlights on the West Coast. Next years, we might be looking more broadly at the US, but for now, we want to keep it focused on these 13 states, also in order to really guide you to the best extent that we can and to be sort of in the same time zones as well during your internship position itself. I see questions coming into the chat. Michelle, can I ask you to moderate, or shall I look into the chat? I don't know what.
Yeah, no, the one was, I guess, and the reason why we're showing you this is because we do encourage you to reach out to companies that are based in these states, because that's where the Consulate General still has an outreach. So, and that's where we can, with the J1 visa, come into agreement, as I understand it correctly. So, and that's for this year's program. And I don't think that message came across as clearly when we initially asked you to reach out to companies. And this is what we're realizing as well, is that we do need to widen our net a little bit. And the area isn't, these are the areas included. And then there was one other question, but we will discuss that later after the updates. Perfect. Great. So then, just very briefly, this is the kind of, just as a reminder, this is the draft. If you do reach out to companies, we would encourage you to just, make it very clear that you're coming through our program. It's, should only boost. We want you to have like a step up through our program if you do take your own initiative. And at the moment, this is the best way to go about it. Then I'll hand over the mic to Eva, who will chat a bit about our two successful candidate experiences that we've had so far.
Yeah, so it's quite a festive week that the first two candidates have found a match. Larissa, she couldn't be here, unfortunately, but she found a match with Natron Energy, and she found it herself, and she was so kind to share a bit about how she's gone about it. So what she did look into Googled a lot of companies that are focusing on the niche that she's interested in, which is battery development, clean tech, solar panels. And then she reached out to quite 12 companies, I think she said. She created like a top. I went structurally through it, and if she wouldn't get a reply from somebody in the company, she would try again a week later or a few days later, another person from the company. And like with Natron Energy, she didn't get a reply from a recruiter. Then she tried the head of talent, and there she built a nice relationship with. And now we're also in touch with this head of talent, and have shared other profiles as well of you for another team. So this is how we can also together create the ball rolling. Yeah, so she's now in the procedure of discussing her contract. And she also had an interview with Applied Materials, which Gijs will also share a bit about after this. And she had a very different experience in her interview with Applied Materials as the interview with Natron Energy. With Natron Energy, there were 3 persons. There was a lot of time, and it was more dialogue, more like in the Netherlands, more personally. And at Applied Materials, it was a bit more. It was with 1 person, and it was a shorter interview, and it was very concrete on the role and on her skills, a bit more formally and focused on the content of the role and less personal. So I think this says that not every interview in Silicon Valley is the same interview, and it will vary per company what type of experience you'll have. But I thought it would also be nice, Gijs, if you could share how you found your match with Applied Material. Like how did you expect? What did you expect of the interview? How did you prepare, and what was the reality?
Yeah, so in short, of course, in the end, you found the match, so that was really nice. I did hear of the company before, but I wasn't really expecting to interview with a company like that, because it's of course a really huge company, and we are right now really talking a lot about startups and stuff. But these kind of companies are also, of course, present there in the Valley. So in terms of the interview itself, I thought it was nothing really special in terms of some surprises or something. So the interview was, for me, really nice. My interviewer was pretty informal. I don't know if that for Larissa, if she's been interviewing in another division, that might have been different.
Yeah.
So, and what you said about like that there's less focus on, for example, behavioral questions, that was indeed the case for me as well. So it was more about more the qualities that I have related to the job itself, and not so much talking about strong traits or weak traits, that kind of stuff.
I was thinking about what Adriaan said about that you should have different anecdotes of what you're good at. I think this also came back in your interview, right? Like you had to think of a few times that you worked on scenario planning.
Yeah, definitely. So I would advise everyone, and then I think that makes sense for every interview, to just go through your CV, and at every point at your CV, just think about all the relevant stuff that happened, and think of a story next to it. And basically any question you get then after, you can almost always like tie back to one of the stories that you prepared. So I wouldn't start preparing like specific questions, because then the list of questions that they can ask is like endless. So it's better to just focus on the stories, and most stories will probably fit on multiple questions. So for example, I had questions about what my biggest challenge was during an internship I did. And the story that I told was basically the story that I prepared for my best achievement, basically. But I used it for biggest challenge, because usually an achievement means that there was some challenge as well. So yeah, that's really something I can advise people to do. Yeah.
Nice. Well, congratulations. Very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, we hope we're going to share a lot more of these stories. And we have some more questions that we got in from you that we will now address.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. Yeah, I'm really hoping that this is also just like inspires you guys to, yeah, that this will just get the ball rolling and we'll see a lot more matches in the next coming weeks. So in the interest of time, we have a bunch of questions that you guys still submitted. So we're just gonna push those out now. So first question, would you advise to apply to internship vacancies posted on LinkedIn or the company website?
Yeah, we would say that you could always try both. Like be proactive and try everything that you have in your power to get yourself noticed at the company. So yeah, that would be our advice for that.
Deborah, so would you advise adding a cover letter? So we had briefly discussed that actually.
Yeah, indeed. I think it depends. You can do it, but I think in the first line, especially if it's a first contact with the company, I would just send my resume and I would just send an accompanying message, which explains a bit your motivation. And I would also make sure that your resume includes a brief bio that can also explain, you know, why you're looking for a particular role. That way you're also taking away the need of a cover letter at this stage.
Perfect. The next is, so when contacting a recruiter, how long should I wait before sending a message again? If I do not receive a response, shall I then try to reach out with another recruiter? So I would wait about 3 working days before sending them another message. And I would send out to multiple recruiters. I wouldn't wait until the one doesn't reply. This kind of stuff, at least getting the ball rolling initially takes time that you don't necessarily have. So I would prioritize, working in parallel and seeing what sticks. Next question is, so I have connected with a recruiter over LinkedIn. Do I continue the conversation there or do I move over to their email? And what if they've only shared their private email over LinkedIn?
Yeah, we say it would always be preferred to find, to get in touch through a work email, but that's not always easy to find. So if you have a very active conversation on LinkedIn and the recruiter is also present there a lot, you could keep the conversation on LinkedIn, but you could definitely otherwise also try their private email. But the best thing will be to find their professional email, which often they are hidden. So you just have to ask for it maybe in the conversation. Yeah.
So next is, so would you advise to get in touch with a recruiter first and explain a bit about the program and before asking questions generally about the company or the position?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's always a good idea to briefly mention, you know, that you're a part of a very selective program that is a partnership between the Dutch government and the 13 research universities in the Netherlands. I think it's also worth mentioning that, you know, this is actually sort of we haven't mentioned this yet to you, but as soon as you arrive in the Bay Area and you have your internship position secured, then you will have the title of a Holland in the Valley Fellow that you can also add to your LinkedIn. You could also add this already in the outreach that, you know, as soon as the internship starts, that you will actually be having the title of a Holland in the Valley Fellow. In Europe, fellow titles like that might not have the same bandwidth as they do in the US. This might actually help you as well. And also if you can mention that there are program managers available to take them through all questions with regard to visa procedures, that also reassures a lot of companies that you're not reaching out individually and that they will need to do all the heavy lifting with regard to the logistics for you.
Perfect. And then, so I have not received a mail stating that my CV has been shared. Can this be due to the fact that I indicated a preference late in the year or due to some other factors? So short answer is, if we haven't sent you an email, your CV hasn't been shared yet. And that is definitely not due to the fact that you've added a preference for late in the year. At the moment, we're not looking at that at all. We're purely looking at your CV and what skill sets you have. And the preference comes later. So once we've had some interest to tease the company with, then we kind of maybe strike up the conversation then, but at the moment, that hasn't been a factor at all. Next question, so what are important things to keep in mind when looking for new companies.
I really liked what Adriaan said there, that there's a there's a startup or a company in every field. So I think that's also a match there. So you could, and also I like what he said about sharing to a company what you will bring to the company. So I think the more you find a company that is a match with the things that you've done in life or the things that you're passionate and ambitious about, the more chance you have that they will be interested in you. Yeah. And I also agree that maybe we can do better as a program and try to share more links of more like startup scaled ups through the network. What do you think? Yeah.
Next, so when I interview, should I ask about logistics, things like insurance, housing, salary?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first interview should really be highlighting your skills, also showing the company that you've researched them, that you know what they represent when it comes to their products, but also to their cultural, their cultural fit, to what extent you see yourself fitting into the company. You can steer the conversation slightly into that direction already during your first interview. Being, you could ask them what typically would be, for example, a salary attached to this role. I would phrase it like that then, but typically that would not yet be in a first interview. I would also ask them before you head into your interviews what the interviewing process is at each company. Some companies will have one interview. If this is your one interview, then yeah, you should ask for it. If they say no, you will first be speaking with your line manager, then you will be speaking with the CEO, and then you will go to the HR. Then you will basically only have the opportunity to talk about salary in that third step with the HR. So I would really have your expectations clearly set in stone already before heading into that first interview. You can steer the conversation slightly into it, but I would not do that too strong yet. I would mainly do that when you're talking with somebody of the C-level suite or ideally with HR. And then indeed, you should be talking about salary. You should be talking about any other questions you have. You do have health insurance through the program, so you can mention that. If the company wants to offer additional health insurance, they can. Housing typically is not offered neither by the employer nor by the program. So it's mainly the salary that you would need to focus on. And I would ask them, I would do some research on websites like Glassdoor in advance to see what people in similar roles typically make, and take that as a benchmark for yourself also before heading into the conversation. And I would like to really also call for all of the women attending here today, and also of all of our candidates from minority backgrounds. Don't be shy, when asking about salary, especially also in the Bay.
All right, next question. So when a new company is interested in hosting potentially multiple interns, is there a way you could let us know so we can contact them, or is that handled by you? So that is handled by us. So we generally, the companies that we've approached, we expect them to at least interview a bunch of interns, and they don't disclose to us upfront how many positions they have. This is often a very flexible thing. If they like what they see, they might make a position. So we don't know upfront, and that's a very, dependent on the particular scenario case. So, but that is handled by us. And then finally, so on what basis do you select profiles to share with companies, and how can I increase my chances of my profile being shared?
Yeah, so at the moment we look at a match between the skill set and what the companies need. But we also look at which resumes have been shared yet and which haven't, and actively look for roles that match with candidates whose resumes have not been shared yet. Mm. And there was also a question in the chat about the 13 companies that are listed on our website. And we've now mentioned we're in touch with 17. The companies on our website, the overview is not up to date. There have been some warm partners that are less warm than they were during our first edition, but there also has been a lot of new leads. So this is a very dynamic process. So you could reach out to any company that you find interesting yourself, and the chances that we'll cross each other's efforts, we don't think it will damage anything for any of us. Yeah.
That's it from our side. So if you do have any questions, time to raise your hand. Yeah, perfect. One person, Federica.
Yes, I had a question about the fact that you showed that 15 students are now have an interview scheduled. And I was wondering if we received the update that our CV has been shared, but we haven't received the interview update yet. What does that mean?
Sure, I can take this. So, so 15 interviews does not mean 15 students. A lot of them have doubled up actually. And the next, so if we've shared your CV, we are still in the process of in discussion with the company. So sometimes we're not, we haven't made contact with the HR person or the recruiter that will then be doing the interviews. So sometimes it's a bit of a roundabout process. And if you haven't received a declined email, that means that we're still in that process.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no, perfect. Next question is Francesca.
Hi, yeah, first, thank you for answering like all these questions. I thought it was really helpful. So I've been actually wondering, because there's some companies on the website, like that you have listed on the website, that I find really interesting, and I would really like to get the chance to, I don't know, share my profile with them or something. And so I was wondering, because right now we don't really have any influence with whom you are sharing my CV with. And I was wondering if there's any way I could have more like control over this, because just there's like 1 or 2 companies that I would really like to have the chance to do an internship at. So is there any way of like, could I just ask you to be like, oh yeah, could you share my CV with those companies, or is it just out of my control?
Yeah, I think the difficult thing is that the companies that we're in touch with, they can have quite specific demands. So if we share other profiles than yours, that's because they've asked for that. But we will share yours if you're the best match. So I think there's less control for you with the partners that are on our website. But you have all the control in the world of every other company in Silicon Valley that is not on the website, which there will be many that you'll find very interesting probably.
Yeah, because according to what do you like, where do you take our skills from? Is it like you look at the CV and look at the study background we have, or is it what we indicated at?
It's everything, yeah.
It's mainly when we talk to our talent partners, we ask them what type of internship positions they're looking for, in what departments, and what skills they're looking for. And then we cross-check that basically with the database that we've created based on all of your resumes and skill sets. So if they ask for UX UI designers, their marketing backgrounds, we're not going to push to these companies. Or if a company asks us for somebody with R&D experience, we're not going to push somebody who does not have that particular skill set at that point in time, because this is basically what the company has reached out to us about at that point in time. However, I do realize, if you're very passionate about a few companies, we're always happy to hear from you. I would just say, write us an email, list them, and say, maybe briefly, don't make it too long of an email, but briefly mention maybe why these companies and in what type of roles you would see yourself at these companies. And then we can review, we can always ping it and see what they say. But unfortunately, we can't decide which candidates they will want to move forward with. But definitely reach out to us.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I will try that then. Thanks you.
We also keep track of what you've indicated to us until now, the companies that you're interested in, and we do take that into consideration. So we look at everything. Yeah.
And I think one other important thing to note is when you initially filled out a Google form highlighting kind of leads companies that weren't part of our list, And we are making really good progress at contacting all of those. So, and those are, you are more than welcome to also contact them yourselves, but we're tackling that from both angles. So know that that's also something that we're putting a lot of emphasis on. So, and there were a lot of, it's a very long list actually, which is amazing. So we know at least that if you put it down, you'll be one of the first people that will at least have in mind it when we do have a warm lead with that company. And then another hands up by Marita.
Yes, yeah, I have one question. So some companies have vacancies, and here you can apply it. And we had a nice email, the form we can send out. Should you advise to send out the email as well as apply on the vacancy, or only send out an email? Or yeah, what would you advise on that?
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, so yeah, I would just do both. To be honest, I think more outreach is better. It won't harm you. I think just make sure the quality is good. If you are going to do that double effort, make sure that both give a good impression of yourself.
Yeah, I would do both.
Tailor make an email that the text that we provided, it's not set in stone, just tailor make it as much as possible to the position in the company, and also your tone of voice and what you think is the best approach. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would do both, but I would refer to the other application as well that you've done. So I would write in your email, for example, first do online and then send the email. I mentioned the email. I have applied online, or I would first write the email and then say, I will also be applying directly on the role, just so they can cross-reference that. I think that always looks professional as well and well thought through on your end, rather than maybe randomly shooting your arrows all at once. So I would just mention it wherever you can.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Right, thanks.
Have any other questions? Because otherwise, I think then we'll call it for today. Any more? No more in the chat, I don't think either. Yeah, great. Perfect. Yeah, well then wrap it up. Thank you so much for attending. Yeah, so we will be in contact with you soon. And we definitely just encourage you to reach out to those companies. This is a pilot year. We are figuring it out as we go. And the idea is at this moment as well that we're definitely a stepping stone for you to reach a company that with our connection that you wouldn't have otherwise. So let's take that advantage and run with it. And yeah, any last words from the team? All good? Okay, well then we'll call it. And yeah, we'll stop the recording here as well.